Testing, testing. Hello?
Testing, testing. Okay.
So protein is from Changjun International, right? And the other team is from Permissible, and you're going second is So now, pro side speaker one, you will have 4 minutes for your constructive speech. You may begin whenever you're ready.
Judges, are you ready? Opponents, are you ready? Okay, so our time begins now. We affirm that on balance, refugee restrictions in developed countries are permissible. To clarify, we offer the following definitions from Oxford English Dictionary. Refugee, a person who has been forced to leave their country in order to escape war, persecution, or natural disaster. Restriction, a limiting condition or measure, especially a legal one. And for this debate, we think that both entry restrictions and domestic restrictions count. For this debate, we will use a cost and benefit framework. This means we argue that the cost of accepting refugees is too high and the benefit is too low. For our burden, our opponents should prove that refugee restrictions can bring more benefits than the costs. Contention 1, terrorism. Terrorism is affecting the lives of citizens in developed countries, according to Liam Dicken. More than half of terror plots in Germany have involved refugees since the onset of the migrant crisis. And there was no plots in Germany in 2014 and only 2 in 2015. In 2016, however, this increased 8-fold. This is due to the 1 million refugees that Germany took in. To solve this problem, people may argue that vetting can be a solution. However, according to CBN in 2017, dozens of refugees who came to the United States did anything from lying to authorities about ongoing terror plots to personally taking part in them themselves. Also, John Cooper, a spokesman for the Heritage Foundation, told Fox News, "We can't vet an 8-year-old to see if he'll become a terrorist when he turns 18 or 28. This means, with more refugees, the rate of terrorism only increases, and vetting can't be a good solution. Thus, restrictions for entries should be made." Contention 2, unrestricted access is unfeasible. Currently, with refugee restrictions for entry, countries are still struggling with the refugees. For example, according to The Guardian, Italy has rejected a record of 24,800 asylum applications in the last 4 months. And according to BBC, Canada intends to change the law to make it harder for asylum seekers rejected by countries like the US to file refugee claims at the border. All these evidence show that restrictions for the number of refugees that enter is necessary because it's just not realistic enough due to the 25.4 million refugees in the world. Contention 3, nations have the right to control their borders. To show this is warranted, according to Godwin Gill, who formerly served as a legal advisor in the UNHCR, wrote in the Oxford Handbooks of Refugee and Forced Migration Studies, the movement of people between states, whether refugees or migrants, take place in a context in which sovereignty remains important. This is important according to Telecom's solution in 2012. Border control is extremely important in controlling and examining all those who enter or leave a country, especially today. In a world pledged with terrorist threats and criminal acts, border security means and allows a country to monitor all people, animals, and goods that travel across its borders. To put this simply, governments have the right to control their borders and is essential for a nation's security. Contention 4, refugees bring negative economic impacts. According to your UNHCR Standing Committee, refugees compete with local citizens for scarce resources such as land, water, housing, food, and medical services. Over time, their presence leads to more substantial demand in natural resources, education, and health facilities, energy, transportation, social services, and employment. So, in conclusion, because the increased rate of terrorism, the low feasibility, the right for countries to control their borders, and the negative economic impact that the refugees will bring, please vote for pro. Thank you.
Opponents ready? Judges ready?
Condition 1. Accepting refugees will cause economic benefits to developed countries. Firstly, a new study conducted by UC Davis with the United Nations World Food Program indicates that refugees receiving aid, especially in the form of cash, can give their host country's economy a substantial boost. In 2015, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees accommodated over 15 million refugees, mostly in refugee camps in developing countries. The World Food Program provided these refugees with food aid in cash or in kind. This research reveals that cash aid to refugees creates significant positive income spillovers to host country. Businesses and households. An additional adult refugee receiving cash aid increases annual real income in the local economy by $205 to $253, significantly more than $120 to $126 in aid each refugee receives. Also, trade between the local economy and the rest of Rwanda increased by $49 to $55. Secondly, the influx of motivated refugees fuels up demand for workers. Workers are labor force, and we know that developed countries are faced with population aging, low birth rate, so they could not regenerate that high birth rate than before. Thus, refugees could be a high labor force for developed countries. For example, refugees are vital to the U.S. labor market by filling needed jobs, and as a group have a higher employment rate than the U.S. born population. Male refugees of working age had a 67% employment rate from 2009 to 2011, while native-born males had only a 60% employment rate during the same time period. Refugees are also more likely than the U.S. born population and older immigrants to be of working age. The combination of refugees' high employment rate and their substantive working age population signals that they are likely to be important contributors to their local economies. Contention 2. Based on the spirit of humanitarian, developed countries should accept refugees without restriction. How poor are the refugees? Refugees mean a non-representative subsample of the pre-conflict Syrian population, a population in economic, social, physical, and psychological distress, but a population with limited access to essential institutions. Most people would like to see innocent refugees and their families find sanctuary. This stems from humanitarian motives and not from narrow self-interest. We can therefore think of refugees who gain protection as what economists call a public good. Furthermore, for 2 decades, the EU has been developing a common asylum system. This has focused on harmonizing various components of asylum policy. The preference has been for countries voluntarily offer places for refugees at times of crisis rather than to enforce a location system. That is, until now, in May 2018, the European Commission called on every member state to take in a certain number of refugees according to their individual capacity. Richer, larger countries will be asked to take more, smaller, less wealthy member states will be asked to take fewer. Contention 3. The chaos and disorders can be solved by proper management. In this case, under proper management, accepting refugees without restrictions is practical. In fact, the latest official crime figures we have from Germany show that 5.76 million crimes were reported in 2017. As a percentage of the population, this means crime is now at its lowest level for 30 years. This data can show clearly not all the refugees will increase the disorders and chaos in one country, and good management of the country can solve the problem. Therefore, under proper management, refugee restrictions are not permissible. Thank you.
Does anybody need to use their question?
Can we use just 20 seconds, please? Thank you.
That's fine. Crossfire between two speaker ones. You will have 3 minutes. You may begin whenever you're ready.
Now, we begin. So let me start off with my first question is about your humanitarianism for the refugees. Don't citizens also have humanitarianism? Don't they also have human rights? If the citizens are denying the refugees, they don't want the refugees in, the government lets the refugees in, this is violating their human rights.
I'm sorry, the refugees do have human rights. They are equal as every citizens in developed countries and developing countries, which means that these residents have their choice to choose they want to accept refugees or not.
Yeah, then residents
Okay,
have, if
it's
they
my
have
turn
the
to ask
choice.
you a question.
Okay, please. Ask me.
Since these developed countries have evoked so many wars, they should take these refugees, shouldn't they?
Okay, so give me an example of one of the wars caused by the developed countries. Okay, so
for example, the war in 2003, Libyan war in 2011, and Syrian war up to now.
So it's this Libyan war?
Yeah.
Okay, then we are still protecting the refugees, but why do we have to let them into the borders in order to protect them? Why are their lives at
you are
risk?
not answering my question directly because I'm asking you about these responsibilities. You know.
Yes, they are responsible. They are protecting them outside of the border, but not inside of the border. Why do you have to let them inside of your country in order to protect them?
Refugees were forced to leave their own country, so the developed countries have to accept them. They have no place to live.
They can live in camps outside of the borders that are safe for them, and the governments can still provide things for them.
So how many things can be provided? There are 40% of children in refugees.
Yeah, the food, shelter, all those things.
How about
can live in
education?
camps.
40% of
Then we can
refugees
give them
are children.
Yeah, we can give them education in the camps. So how is that not possible?
Since you have to spend so many money in the camps, why just don't let them in and let them get jobs and let them make money?
Because they're going to cause problems when they're in your country. And also, there's a large number of refugees. We can't accept that many. It's going to cause lots of problems for the countries, like terrorism, economic
Sorry,
impacts.
in my conventions too, I have mentioned that the treatment of refugee acceptance is that large country accept more and smaller country accept less. So
Then should China accept more refugees than
China
the US?
is not a developed country. So we are talking about developed countries.
Okay, then what? Then how about Canada? Canada is the second largest country in the world. So why does it not accept many refugees? There's a system, and they're restricting we have evidence right here, and in our contention, we said Canada is changed the system for the refugees.
They are changing the system, so they are not take up their responsibilities.
But the Canada's never caused the problem. They don't have responsibility for them. Can I have 30 seconds of prep time, please? Judges ready? Opponents ready? So my time start now. So first, in response to my opponent's defense on their first contention about boost economy, we argue that because according to UNHCR, there is a large number of refugees existing right now. It's 25.4 million refugees. And we don't know what would cost. Like if a developed country just accepting all those refugees in their countries, this will cause problems. Like in contention 1, we proved that there is terrorism hiding in those refugee groups. And if the developed countries just without any restrictions just let those refugees in, how much danger will they cost? So their first contention, and also according to the focusing on economy, we argue that because there is a large number and we don't know what will happen because because a long time run, in a long time run, that will cause a negative impact in our contention 4. We mentioned that we can provide evidence for this. According to the economists in 2016, refugee will add around 0.19% of GDP to public expenditure in the European Union. This will add to public debts and a given higher joblessness. So, according to this will cause negative impact on economy. So their first contention is wrong. And for their second contention about labor force, they're saying that they can bring much young laborers taking from their refugees to let them do the labor jobs. And also, I have evidence saying that according to the State Department, more than 72% of refugees resettled in the United States in 2016 are women and children. So they're arguing that they're going to let the children to do the labor jobs. That's terrible. And for their contention 3 about humanitarianism. Humanitarianism, as we have mentioned, we're not just block those access to refugees. We can still take in. We're just taking the little amount. It's still restrictions. And we have evidence for this. Take examples of Canada. Canada have a system of security checks. They have the refugees come in. They will give them a security check. So the refugee need to stay out of the borders in those camps to stay for example, 2 to 3 years to accepting those security checks. This is restrictions. And so now, I want to reinforce our contention. Our contention 1 about terrorism is important because we proved that there are such problems in refugees. So we have responsibility for our own citizens. We have their obligations to protect them all, our citizens' life. And also, of course, we can still save the refugees' life outside the camp. They're just finding a place to survive. We can still provide them with good sanitation, good environment, resources like land, water, so they can still survive. And also, we still save the life. We prevent those harms from refugees to our own citizens. So we protect both groups in the same time. That's a win-win solution. And for the our second contention is unrestricted is unfeasible, because if you open restrictions, if no restriction are made, then those problems will cause. Like terrorism will just boost. And so our third contention is the right to control borders. This is so important because every country needs to defend their own border. So please, for all of these, please vote for pro. Thank you.
Sorry, speaker 2. You have 4 minutes.
Testing. Just ready? Opponents ready? So I may start right now. So firstly, our topic is related to developed countries. Germany is not equal to developed countries. The US is not equal to developed countries. The UK is not equal to developed countries. Therefore, in this topic, we are talking about all the developed countries in the world. Your side may ask that's why we have to consider all the developed countries in the world. The answer is that intrinsically, refugee crisis is a global issue rather than a regional issues. Refugee crisis originate from different history backgrounds and they exist in different areas for different causes. In fact, refugee crisis exists in Middle East, South Africa, Venezuela, Africa, Europe, or even North Korea. It exists everywhere in the world. Thus, we cannot just simply discuss one country or European countries, American countries, because refugee crisis is a global issue. Hence, from a global perspective, refugee restrictions should not be permissible because all the developed countries will cooperate and share responsibilities for accepting refugees based on their own interior situations. Wealthier nations with adequate resources could afford more refugees than others. All the developed countries will and are able to accept refugees, and there will be no longer such restrictions. Secondly, you are talking about democratic systems. So, does democracy actually means that the government has to follow the majorities of the populations? No. Even the president of the United States is elected by the electoral college, not the general public. Actually, the president and the government represents the countries, and especially in these global complicated refugee issues, presidents can choose whether or not to accept refugees based on their own interior situations. So, second, and also, thirdly, just like what we have mentioned, no restrictions does not mean no management. Refugees still have to follow the laws, rules, and regulations of their host countries. Your side may attribute all these negative influences caused by refugees to no restrictions, but under proper management, all this problem can be solved. In fact, the latest official crime figures we have from Germany show that 5.76 million crimes were reported in 2017 as a percentage of the population. This means that crime is now at its lowest level for 30 years. Furthermore, the vast majority of terror attacks in Europe are carried out by Euro citizens. No refugees were involved in terror attacks in Europe, based on the reports by the Danish Institute of International Studies. I'm not saying that accepting refugees will lower the crime rate and make place safer. Instead, we should attribute all these achievements such as decline crime rates and increased security to proper and comprehensive management. Thus, all the so-called negative influences, including crime, violence, and disorders, could be solved, and this should not be the excuses of restricting refugees entering developed countries. In conclusion, under appropriate management, refugee restrictions are totally impermissible. Thirdly, we just talk about ethics. Ethically, refugee restrictions are totally impermissible because most of the wars in the world are triggered by developed countries. They are responsible for taking refugees without any excuses. Let's look back on Iraqi wars in 2003, Libyan wars in 2011, Syrian wars up to now. So, statistically, developing nations have hosted almost 86% of the refugees in the world. What about these richest developed countries? Those troublemakers? The answer is, in comparison with millions of refugees that developed countries have hosted, there are only 8,000 refugees in Canada, 6,000 in UK, 3,000 in Sweden. What a shame. What about humanitarians? What about democracy? What about redemption in Christians? Despite all the positive or negative consequences caused by accepting refugees, refugee restrictions are indubitably ethically impermissible.
Testing. So judges ready? Opponents ready?
Yes.
Okay, so crossfire starts now. So first, I want to ask you a question. Do you agree that terrorism is bad?
Yes, terror is bad.
Then why should we just let those terrorists just filter our country?
Do you think restrictions is a good solution to avoid terrorists?
Like, according to this, we've proved that. We have evidence saying that. Washington Times in 2017, the CIA said that last year the terrorist group's official strategy is to hide its operatives among refugees. So we proved that.
Also, we have research done that the US government does not have access to any database in Syria that can be used to check the backgrounds of incoming refugees against criminal and terrorist records. This means that the screening and vetting and restriction system nowadays is not effective, right? So restrictions does not mean that you can avoid all the terrorists. And we're not here to discuss how to solve the terrorists in the world, okay? So it's my turn to ask the questions.
Okay, you can ask me questions.
So, actually, the cost is less than the benefits.
No.
We have evidence show this.
We also have evidence show this because according to our fourth contention, we mentioned that refugee cause negative impact on economy.
So could you just ignore all the economic benefits of accepting refugees?
Okay.
As developed countries are faced with aging problems and labor force is extremely important to developed countries, and they cannot regenerate that high birth rate than before. So refugees can be a chance to require a lot of labor force to enhance the economy.
No, just as I have mentioned, we argued that according to the State Department, more than 72% of refugees resettled in the US in 2016 are women and children. Are you letting those children to do the labor force?
We're not saying that. Also,
so according to your logic about humanitarianism, you're asking those children to do those labors.
No, also it's like that. So you also claim that there are camps that you can let refugees to stay in.
Okay, now it's our time to
So
ask questions.
please.
Okay. So, about what you just mentioned about Germany, because we argue that has Germany taken many more refugees because we think that those terrorists have already been attacked. So, do you think that the things that you have mentioned about Germany should not be valued?
Should not be valued? Of course, Germany is, but you are talking about. So, what kind of restrictions are we talking about?
We are talking about number restrictions.
Okay, you are talking about restrictions the numbers, right? But even the richest person in the world cannot save all the refugees in the
Yes,
world.
because we can't save and we can't protect our own citizens from refugees. So we need number restriction. We need to give them those checks, security checks. And according to the Century Foundation organization, for US, there are biometric and biographic checks. Thank you.
Summary speech of You will have 2 minutes. You may begin whenever you're ready.
Judges, are you ready? Opponents, are you ready? So my summary begins now. So please let me start it off with reinforcing our contentions. Our first contention is about terrorism. We are arguing that with the increased rate of terrorism, there's going to be more, with more refugees, there's going to be an increased rate of terrorism. And they gave us an example of Germany. But we think the Germany example is true because the refugees that came into the Germany has already been caught. That means the terrorists that already infiltrated the country has all been caught. And we are not sure if Germany has taken in any more new refugees. So please provide some evidence for that. 2, about feasibility. We are saying that because there's so many refugees in the world, it is basically impossible for all the countries to take in that much refugees. And the opponents even said that the richest person in the world can't even help all the refugees. That means how can a developed country, or like all the developed countries, be able to do that? And if they share the refugees, they're going to share their problems, which we don't know what's going to happen. So we can't make assumptions. 3, about nations' rights to control the borders. This means every country should be able to control their borders. And we're not sure if one country is going to open its borders to the refugees. And so we can't make sure that every country is going to open its borders to the refugees. Okay, so for the 4th contention about economic impact, we are going to argue that there are lots of refugees. So this means you are arguing that refugees can bring good economic impact. But when there's large numbers, we are not sure too. So for their contentions, number 1, they say that can fill in the demand for the workforce. And we said most of them are women and children. So it's very hard. And the second contention about humanitarianism. For our side, we're trying to say that we're going to protect both at the same time, but we're not going to allow the refugees into our borders because of the problems they might bring. 3, about the chaos that they're going to bring, and if we don't allow them to get in. If we bring them in, there's also going to be chaos.
You will have 2 minutes. You may begin whenever you're ready.
Judges ready? Opponents ready? Okay, time starts now. Okay, in your summary, you have mentioned many times for we think and we are not sure about Germany problems and other problems. Is that assumption? Okay, and about the terrorism, I have mentioned that in my contention 3, that the chaos and disorders do not mean that good management and policies cannot solve these problems. For example, Germany, after good management, the crime rate was at the lowest level in 30 years. And in USA, from 1975 to 2015, 40 years period, there are only 3 refugees who were involved in terrorism attacks. According to above discussion, we have mentioned that refugees is a kind of economic source for many countries. Many refugees have their own company and provide jobs for local people. They have bring many benefits for developed countries. Seldom of them have been involved in violent events or terrorism. Most of them are coming for peace and do not want to go back to their own country. What we want to highlight is that developed countries are not only a few of them, not a single America, Germany or Japan. This group of developed countries should have responsibility to take care of some refugees. For example, the EU have a treatment that membership in EU have to accept the numbers of refugees correspond to their ability. In addition, many wars in the world were evoked by developed countries. They have to take their responsibility for the countries they have destroyed or lead into the war. 80% of the refugees used to be adopted by developing countries because of the distance. Japan only accepted 28 refugees last year, and other developed countries just accepted 100 of them. But there are 24.5 million refugees around the world because of the belief and the culprits of the wars. They should take some of the refugees and give them place to live. Thank you.
Now it's the grand crossfire. Does anybody need
So, judges ready? So, opponents ready? So, Grand Crossfire starts now. Well, let me ask you the first question. You said that many countries, many developed countries cause the war. So, if one country is causing the war and it causes lots of refugees, is that country taking all the refugees? Because that's impossible if there's like a large number.
So today's, if we are talking about whether or not developed countries should restrict the numbers of refugees entering their countries, of course the answer is this is a fake proposition. So we don't have to debate. Your side will absolutely win. But even the richest people like Bill Gates or Jack Ma, you cannot save all the poor people in the world. So of course today we are not talking about restricting the numbers of countries entering one country, because this kind of restriction of numbers must exist, and it should be the preconditions of today's topic. So this is a totally fake proposition.
So why is this not a restriction? This is needed. This is essential for the nation's security. So then it is a restriction.
Yes, we are taking the responsibility of protecting those refugees, right? We also are.
But no restrictions do not mean we have to take all the refugees.
Then what does it mean?
And also, it's our turn to answer questions.
Okay.
And your side claim about the camps, right? So there are camps to support refugees. But do you know why those refugees flee from the camps to Europe? Because they are suffering cold, food shortage, and other diseases from the camps. So they flee to the Europe.
Do we have evidence? Yeah, please provide us a source for that.
Because we have sources.
Germany has accepted 800,000 of refugees from
Is
camps.
that a lot? There's 25.4 million refugees in the world. They only accepted 800,000.
But for
Do you think that's
Only
enough?
800,000? Only 800,000.
It's not even close to
Never, never was
It is-
bigger than.
This number is even bigger than the 60,000 of numbers
and
that
they're
EU have taken in a whole year.
Okay,
And
you
they're
mean
suffering
they're
from
still-
terrorism, and they're suffering from all those kinds of problems.
So in response, you attack on camps, right? So you mean Germany keep those refugees in camps?
And
This is not right? The evidence you provide is not true. Okay, so because we have evidence saying that we in Bidi in northwestern Uganda, it is the host. It's the most generous and progressing approach to hosting the refugees in regions, right? And it's the largest refugee camps in the world.
Based on the spatial dimension that you claim, your side claims that restrictions should be permissible because there's no place for accepting more refugees. Are you sure we are using the
We're not
space?
saying there's no more space. We've never said that.
So you're saying that there's too many peoples and there should be restrictions.
Because
It will
there's-
cause
Yeah,
it will cause problems.
It's going
right?
to cause more problems with the
What
more people.
problems?
So are you using the theory
Our
of
first
space?
intention
So-
is terrorism.
Sorry.
Why don't you just
There's
have
no-
focus on this? Because this is a problem, right? Because according to, like, for example, 911, how
And
many?
we have
how many
so
terrorists
that-
is
Can you
We have
please
so that-
stop interrupting?
Sorry,
us?
we have so that there's no evidence. So that there's resident refugees involving terror attacks.
Would you like to use up all the time? And that's 1 minute and 10 seconds.
So, judges ready? Opponents ready? So my time start now. So first, please let me reinforce our contention. Our first contention is about terrorism. Our second contention is about unrestricted is unfeasible. Our third contention is the right to control borders. And the fourth contention is refugee will bring negative costs to the economy. So first, because we can't bring new things in the final focus, so I want to mention one thing. Like our opponents always denying our definition about number restrictions, but they never provide never provide what is restrictions. So their attack should not be valid. And so for our first contention about terrorism, this is so important because we proved that there are terrorists hiding in refugees, and as I just mentioned in Grand Crossfire, 911, how many people have been killed because of terrorists? So this is very important. We have to protect the lives of our citizens. And also, we still save the life of refugees, right? We can provide them, we can save them in refugee camps. And our second contention is because there is a large number, so it is unfeasible, impossible for developed countries to receive all of them because they're going to share those problems like terrorism. And it's same condition for our fourth contention because for a long term there is so many refugees, so we don't know what will happen, and we have provided that will higher joblessness rates. And for our third contention, they didn't attack it because this is so important. Every country has the right to control their borders. For their first contention about boost economy, we said that because there is a large number, so we don't know what in the long term this economy will be. And for their second contention about labor force, we proved that, we provide evidence saying that a large proportion of refugees is children and women. So they're arguing about that. They're letting children to do the labor job. So for all of these, please vote pro. Thank you.
Wait, listen.
You still have 1 minute and 30 seconds of time. Would you like to use it?
So, judge ready? Opponents ready? So, I may start now. Firstly, if we are talking about whether or not developed countries should restrict the numbers of refugees entering the countries, this is a fake proposition I need to emphasize again. Because even the richest people, Bill Gates, Jack Ma, they cannot save all the poor people in the world. Therefore, today, of course, we are not talking about restrictions of the numbers. And what about so what kind of restrictions are we talking about? And your side claim about there are terrorists hiding in refugees, but we have evidence shows that there's no refugees involved in terrorist attacks in 2017. This cannot be the hiding, cannot be the excuses. So today we are talking about the restrictions of this kind of bias, this kind of discriminations, this kind of prejudice. We have to ease restrictions, this kind of things. This is the topic that we talk about. And ethically, the total restrictions should not be permissible. As we said, all developed countries, all the troublemakers have triggered most of the wars in the world, and they should take responsibilities to accept refugees without any restrictions based on the ethical perspective. And finally, there are some economic benefits of accepting refugees. After the Cultural Revolution in mainland China in 1960, 750,000 refugees fled to Hong Kong after decades, which admits that without that huge of labor force brought by mainland China refugees, Hong Kong's economy will not surge and boost in 1970s to 1990s. I'm not saying that Hong Kong is a developed country, but its experience and social status can compare with developed countries. So, if we can convert refugee crisis into a refugee reform, accepting refugees will definitely facilitate the economy, and it will be a great revolution in human histories. As a result, in this case, refugees restrictions should not be permissible at all. And based on the restrictions about bias and prejudice and those fake propositions, I think we side should win. Okay.
好的，感谢两队选手的精彩表现。我们请选手们这个友好的握手之后，先回座休息。我们会在颁奖典礼的时候公布这场比赛的结果。大家先，我知道心有点悬啊，但是等一等，耐心等一等。